The late afternoon sun painted the Wyoming grasslands in shades of amber and gold, as Samuel McCready guided his mare Belle along the familiar creek that bordered his ranch. At 62 years old, Samuel had seen enough hardship to fill 3 lifetimes, yet somehow the land still spoke to him in ways that brought peace to his weathered soul. The sound reached him first, a desperate voice carried on the prairie wind. Samuel pulled Belle to a gentle halt and listened more carefully. There it was again, a woman's voice calling out in what sounded like distress. Samuel urged Belle forward through the tall grass, following the sound until he came upon a sight that made his heart skip. A young woman, perhaps in her 20s, was struggling in the deeper part of the creek, where the current ran swift and cold. Her dark hair clung to her face, and there was something red staining the water around her. Blood, he realized with alarm. "Please," she called out when she spotted him. "I'm begging you. Help me." Without hesitation, Samuel dismounted and waded into the creek. The water was colder than he'd expected, and the rocks beneath his boots were slick with moss. As he drew closer, he could see the woman's face more clearly, pale with exhaustion and marked with cuts and bruises that spoke of recent violence. "Easy now," Samuel said in the same gentle tone he used with frightened horses. "I've got you." The woman seemed to collapse with relief as Samuel's strong arms encircled her. She was lighter than he'd expected. Too light, he thought, as if she hadn't eaten properly in days. As he lifted her from the water, he noticed her clothes were torn and her feet were bare and bleeding. "Who did this to you, child?" Samuel asked softly as he carried her to the creek bank. "My husband," she whispered so quietly he almost missed it. "Former husband. I thought I got away, but he found me." Samuel felt something cold settle in his chest. He'd known men like that. Men who thought they owned what they couldn't control. Men who mistook fear for respect and violence for strength. "Well, he won't find you on my land," Samuel said with quiet conviction. "That I can promise you." The woman, Martha, she told him her name was Martha, looked up at him with eyes that held both hope and the kind of wariness that comes from too many broken promises. Samuel recognized that look. He'd seen it in the mirror often enough during his own dark years. Samuel wrapped Martha in his coat and helped her on to Belle. The ride back to his ranch house was slow and careful with Samuel, walking alongside to make sure she didn't fall. Martha didn't speak much during the journey, but Samuel could feel her studying him, trying to decide if he was another threat or perhaps finally some small measure of salvation. The ranch house wasn't much to look at, a simple wooden structure that Samuel had built with his own hands after his Sarah had passed 5 years earlier. But it was clean and warm, and right now that seemed like enough. Samuel helped Martha down from Belle and guided her up the porch steps. His old dog Rex raised his grizzled head from his favorite spot by the door and gave a gentle wag of his tail. Rex had always been a good judge of character. Inside, Samuel settled Martha into Sarah's favorite chair by the fireplace. The chair still held the faint scent of lavender from the sachets Sarah used to tuck into the cushions. Samuel often found comfort in that chair himself during the long winter evenings. "I'll get you some dry clothes," Samuel said, "and something warm to drink." He returned with one of Sarah's dresses, soft blue cotton with tiny white flowers, and a thick quilt that had been Sarah's pride and joy. Martha's eyes filled with tears at the kindness, but she didn't speak. While Martha changed, Samuel busied himself in the kitchen, preparing hot soup and fresh coffee. Cooking had been Sarah's domain, but Samuel had learned enough to keep himself fed these past years. Tonight, though, the simple act of preparing food for someone else felt like a small miracle. When Martha emerged from the bedroom wearing Sarah's dress, Samuel was struck by how young she looked, young and scared and trying so hard to be brave. It reminded him of a foal he'd once found, caught in barbed wire, all trembling legs and
wild eyes until gentleness proved
stronger than fear. They ate their soup in comfortable silence as the fire crackled and cast dancing shadows on the walls. Rex had claimed his spot at Martha's feet and was already snoring softly. Even the dog seemed to understand that this was a soul in need of healing. "You don't know me," Martha said finally. "You don't owe me anything." Samuel set down his spoon and looked at her, really looked at her. In the firelight, he could see the fading bruises on her wrists and neck, could see the way she startled at every small sound, could see the exhaustion that went bone deep, child. Samuel said gently, "I've lived long enough to know that kindness isn't about what we owe each other. It's about what we choose to give freely." Martha's eyes filled with tears again, but this time she let them fall. "He said no one would ever help me," she whispered. "He said I was worthless, that I deserved everything he did." Samuel felt an old familiar anger rise in his chest. Not the hot, explosive kind that led to hasty words and regrettable actions, but the cold, steady kind that came from seeing too much injustice in the world. "Martha," he said quietly, "I want you to listen to me carefully. What happened to you wasn't your fault. What he did to you says nothing about your worth and everything about his lack of character." She looked at him then with something approaching wonder, as if the idea that she might be worthy of kindness was foreign to her. "My Sarah used to say that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity," Samuel continued, "not because they've earned it, but because they're human, because they matter." The evening passed quietly with small conversations about simple things, the weather and the wildflowers that bloomed along the creek in spring, and the family of deer that came to drink at dawn. Nothing heavy or demanding, just gentle words that began to build a bridge across the chasm of Martha's fear. That first night, Samuel made up the couch for himself and insisted Martha take his bedroom. He could hear her moving restlessly and knew she was listening for sounds that might signal danger. Samuel understood that kind of vigilance, the way fear could make every creak of the house sound like approaching footsteps. The next morning brought new challenges. Martha's husband, former husband, she corrected herself firmly, arrived at the ranch in a cloud of dust and fury. Thomas Garrett was exactly what Samuel had expected, a big man who used his size to intimidate and his voice to dominate. "I know she's here," Thomas shouted from his horse. "That's my wife and I want her back." Samuel stepped onto his porch slowly, deliberately. At 62, he wasn't as quick as he used to be, but he'd learned that sometimes quiet strength carried more weight than bluster. "There's no one here who wants to see you," Samuel said calmly. "She's my property." Thomas snarled, "Signed papers and everything." Samuel felt something cold and dangerous settle in his chest. He'd never hit a man in anger. Sarah had taught him that violence was the refuge of small minds. But looking at Thomas Garrett, he came close to forgetting that lesson. "Marriage papers aren't ownership papers," Samuel replied, "and even if they were, divorce papers would cancel them out." Thomas dismounted and took a threatening step forward. Samuel didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't show any of the tension coiling in his muscles. Sometimes the best way to handle a bully was to simply refuse to be intimidated. "You're harboring a runaway wife, old man." Thomas said, "That makes you an accessory." "I'm protecting a woman in distress," Samuel corrected. "That makes me a decent human being." The standoff might have escalated, but Martha chose that moment to step onto the porch. She was wearing Sarah's blue dress and holding herself with a dignity that her husband had tried. "So hard to break, I'm not going back, Thomas," she said quietly but firmly. "I filed for divorce yesterday in town." Thomas's face went purple with rage. "You can't survive without me," he bellowed. "You're nothing without me." Martha looked at him then with something that might have been pity. "I survived 20 years of your cruelty, Thomas," she said. "I think I can manage surviving without it." Something in her tone, calm, certain, unafraid, seemed to deflate Thomas's bluster. He looked between Martha and Samuel as if trying to understand how the balance of power had shifted so completely. "This isn't over," he muttered, climbing back onto his horse. "Yes, it is," Martha replied, and there was steel in her voice that Samuel hadn't heard before. After Thomas rode away, Martha sank onto the porch steps, as if her legs could no longer support her. Samuel sat beside her, not speaking, just offering his presence as comfort. "I was so scared," she whispered. "But you stood up to him anyway," Samuel pointed out. "That's not cowardice, child, that's courage." The weeks that followed established a rhythm that felt natural and healing for both of them. Martha helped with the household chores that Samuel had been neglecting since Sarah's death. She mended his shirts and organized his pantry, and filled the house with the sound of humming that Samuel hadn't realized he'd missed. In return, Samuel taught her practical skills: how to ride Belle, how to repair fence posts, how to read the weather signs that warned of approaching storms. More importantly, he showed her through daily example what it meant to be treated with consistent kindness and respect. There were setbacks, of course. Nights when Martha would wake screaming from nightmares, days when unexpected sounds would send her into a panic, times when she would apologize for existing, for taking up space, for being a burden. During those difficult moments, Samuel would simply be present. "It may,"